One of the most important concepts that we're going to work with in AGEC 350 is the idea of value or benefit. We're going to be talking about the benefit that consumers receive from a cleaner environment or more use of natural resources, but really the basic economic concepts that we're going to be dealing with here are general, and they apply to the consumption of any good or the receipt of any service. So, for example, in this case, we're going to look at a graph in which an individual is interested in the quantity of units of cleanup that are provided by, let's say, the government in this case. We're going to measure on the horizontal axis the number of units that are cleaned up, and on the vertical axis we're going to put dollars per unit. So, for example, this individual would be willing to pay $10 if the environment could be cleaned up by 1 unit. So just that first increment of environmental cleanup, the individual would be willing to sacrifice $10 out of his or her pocket in order to get that extra unit. It typically follows that as the quantity of cleanup increases, the willingness to sacrifice to get an additional unit of cleanup tends to fall. So once we've already gotten 1 unit of cleanup, he or she would only be willing to pay $9 to get the next unit, $8 to get the third unit, and $7 to get the fourth unit. We call the height of each of these points the marginal willingness to pay for an incremental unit. So, for example, the height of the first point there on that that we drew was the marginal willingness to pay for the first unit, which was equal to $10. The marginal willingness to pay for the second unit was $9, third is $8, and the fourth is only $7. Now, we can therefore combine those points, or to draw a line through our points, and we get what we call the marginal willingness to pay curve. Or sometimes we'll simply recall this as the willingness to pay curve, but you should remember that this is really a marginal willingness to pay curve. And the height of any point on that curve is going to tell us the marginal willingness to pay for that unit. Now, if you think about those first 4 units that we were looking at before, they were worth $10 for the first unit, $9 for the second unit, $8 for the third, and $7 for the fourth, which gives us total willingness to pay for 4 units of $34. Now, note that the total willingness to pay for 4 units is $34, which is more than the total willingness to pay than for the 3 or 2 or 1. But the marginal willingness to pay for the fourth unit is smaller than the marginal willingness to pay for the first unit. So we can measure it in sort of incrementally like we did before in terms of 10 plus 9 plus 8 plus 7, or we can look at the area under the curve. Now, those aren't exactly equal, but for the purposes of AGEC 350, we're going to treat them as equivalent. So anytime that we're trying to measure the total willingness to pay, you can think of the area under the curve. And so in this case, we have the total willingness to pay for 4 units is the area under the willingness to pay curve from 0 out to 4. And if we went out further, we'd have the total willingness to pay for 9 units from 0 out to 9. Now remember that we're going to call this the marginal willingness to pay curve, but we're equating willingness to pay to benefit. That is, we're using willingness to pay as our measure of benefit. So instead of calling this the marginal willingness to pay curve, we could also call it the marginal benefit curve. And to summarize, the height of the marginal benefit curve, the distance from the horizontal axis up to that point on the curve, is going to tell us the marginal benefit of a particular unit. And the total benefit is then the area under that curve from 0 out to 5. Now that we've started with the idea of benefit, let's switch to the other side of the equation, which we're going to call cost. Now, when we think about cost as economists, what we really mean is opportunity cost. That is, what you have to give up to achieve something. And I like to use the expression, I've never heard anybody else use this, but I like to say what you have to pay. So when we're thinking about benefit, it's what you were willing to pay, and when you're thinking about cost, you say what you have to pay to achieve something. So let's go back to our example of the quantity of cleanup, and we'll say that the government is going to have to pay some costs, maybe labor costs, maybe shutting down industries in order to get the that environmental cleanup, and we're going to assume that the first unit of that cleanup costs $2. Right? So that gives us the marginal cost of that first unit is equal to $2, or the height of that point on the curve. Now in this case, just for simplicity, I'm going to assume that the marginal cost for each unit is exactly the same. So we're going to have every unit, the third, the fourth unit, all cost $2, which means that we're going to have a horizontal marginal cost curve. Now, again, in this example, I'm assuming that every unit of pollution reduction costs exactly the same. That's why we have a horizontal marginal cost curve. That does not always happen. Okay. So the marginal cost is $2, and the total cost, just like in the case of the total benefit, is the area underneath the marginal cost curve out to a particular unit. So the rectangle that we have here would show the total cost for 4 units of cleanup, and if we wanted to get 9 units, we'd go all the way from 0 out to 9, and that would be the total cost for 9 units of cleanup. So to sum up, the cost side of the equation is just the same as the benefit side. We get the marginal cost curve. The height of the marginal cost curve tells us the incremental cost of getting one more unit of cleanup once we've already achieved that many, or we already moved out and cleaned up the environment somewhat. And the total cost is going to be the area underneath the marginal cost curve. Now we're going to move to the third piece of the puzzle, and that is surplus or net benefit. Net benefit because it's benefit minus cost, or I like to call it as willingness to pay minus have to pay. Surplus is what we're looking for as economists, as economic agents. We want to obtain surplus. We want to get the gravy out of the economy. Once we have the concepts of marginal benefit or marginal willingness to pay and marginal cost, getting the surplus is really pretty straightforward. So let's think about that very first unit. The marginal willingness to pay was that the individual was willing to pay to get that first unit of environmental cleanup was $10. The marginal cost that the government had to pay in order to get that environmental cleanup was $2, which means that we have a surplus from that very first unit of cleanup of 10 minus 2, or $8. And again, we're going to simply take the marginal benefit curve and find the distance between the marginal benefit curve and the marginal cost curve, and that will tell us the surplus for every unit. All right, so we see the marginal benefit of the first unit was 8. The marginal benefit of the marginal surplus achieved from the first unit was 8. The marginal surplus achieved from the second unit was 7, and so on and so on. The surplus from 4 units then is going to be the area between the marginal benefit curve and the marginal cost curve. That tells us the gravy that is created, the surplus that is created by cleaning up the environment. That's an economic benefit that the economy has generated. An economic benefit the economy has generated by cleaning up the environment by 4 units. Now notice that the benefits were obtained by the individual in this case, and the costs were paid by the government. We're not going to make any assessment at this point of who pays and whether it's fair or not about who gets the benefit and who pays the cost. We're just going to look at the aggregate and say the benefits of doing this are greater than the cost. So let's summarize these very, very, very important concepts. Benefit, we always are talking about willingness to pay, what you would be willing to give up in order to achieve something. Notice I'm saying willing, that it does not mean that I'm actually going to make that payment. The cost is what you have to pay. So that is what is really going to be a real sacrifice that must be made in order to achieve that benefit. The surplus is equal to net benefit, which is going to be what you are willing to pay minus what you have to pay. Then we've got 2 key concepts that you really have to get clear in your mind, and that is the marginal versus the total. The marginal is the total, is the cost or benefit or net benefit for one more unit, and it's always measured graphically as a distance, a vertical distance in a marginal benefit or marginal cost graph. The total is what you'd pay for all of the units up to a particular level, and that is always measured as the area. So with these basic concepts, all of AGEC 3 all of AGEC 350 is built on the foundation of this very fundamental benefits. And if you didn't get it clear this time, I really encourage you to go back, watch this video again to make sure that these three concepts of benefit, cost, and surplus, and how you differentiate marginal from total are clear to you.